Thank you for joining us at the IT Security and Automation Conference here in Crystal City, Virginia. Happy to be here with all of the NIST people. Today's topic, we're going to cut through the marketing hype and the mixed messages that you get from vendors in the SIEM space, thereby allowing you to make the right technology decision. My name is Anant and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Prism Microsystems. We're the vendors of Event Tracker, a product certainly that's in this space, and so I want you to take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. What are we going to talk about? Well, first we're going to identify what this really means. Is it SIEM or is it SIEM or is it SIM? What exactly is it and what does it mean? Second, we'll look at motivations. Why do people even care about this stuff and why should you bother? We'll look at how vendors have approached the problem, and quite frankly, there are a bewildering number of vendors in this space, each of whom originally set out to solve some different problem, but they're all chasing your IT budget, and so they will all say pretty much the same thing. How do you decide what's right for you? We'll look at that. And then, since you've all had plenty of best practice recommendations, we're going to turn that around and look at it from the worst practices side, what not to do when trying to make a solution. I will also have time for Q&A, but I'm happy to take questions anytime during the presentation. So what's in a name? SIEM, this is a Gartner word for it for this particular space, not one that we think is particularly descriptive or even appropriate or complete in 2011. But briefly, it includes support for both SIM, which is the non-real-time aspect of this technology, which is log management and reporting for compliance purposes, as well as SIEM, which is the incident management portion for security-related events. And of course, this is usually in real time. So SIM plus SIEM should equal to SIEM, but not quite. Don't forget the ops use case, where people are interested in this technology in order to improve their cost of operations. In an era of tighter budgets, there are strong benefits to be gained. So why do customers care about this technology? Why should you care about this technology? One of the main reasons is because of the compliance reporting and the auditing that goes on. So if you are in an industry where you are subject to audits, something like HIPAA for healthcare, Sarbanes-Oxley for public companies, PCI DSS if you're taking credit cards, GLBA or some of the others for the financial industry, FISMA or NISPOM or JAFAN for the DoD or any civilian agency, then these are all motivations to venture into this space. A second reason is threat management. So when people discover that bad guys are getting through, bad guys are trying to get through, then looking at logs and looking at security related events is an excellent brick in the wall and is an excellent early warning system. So when there is fear of attacks, it's an excellent tool for threat management. There are also folks that look at this in an attempt to improve the efficiency of their organization. Nobody's IT budget is simply too big. And so when you're suffering from a reduction in force or you're looking at a cut in your budget and you're thinking about doing more with less, automation is a solution. And so people also look at this in that angle. And just to make sure that you're really awake, I want to throw out the hypothetical that there may be people out there who want to comply with best practice is the reason why they do this. Of course, this is not very often true in the real world, but it's a theoretical reason anyway why you might want this stuff. The space has come quite a long way between 2005 and now. In those years, SANS, the SANS Institute conducts an annual log management survey where they look at the state of the industry and they try to poll and find out what's going on. So back in 2005, hardly 43% of the people who were surveyed even bothered to collect logs. So obviously the space was much less developed as it is today, where nearly 89% of those surveyed collected logs. Fair to say that the SANS Institute polls those organizations that are more likely to be on the leading edge of technology. And so this isn't really very representative of the mainstream, except that it does show you the penetration over the last 7 years shows you that it's managed to make its way quite deep. Now you're getting more data in 2011 according to this survey from physical devices, from plant kinds of from infrastructure pieces, and also from point of sale devices. So there's plenty of data coming in, but is that meaningful? Can you make it dance for you? Do you have information? These are the kinds of questions that are worth asking. By the way, which verticals were represented in this survey that talked to about 757 organizations? As you can see, they're primarily dominated by financial and government, with education, healthcare, telecom, energy sort of bringing up the rear. And most of them are in fact others, so they don't fall into any of these buckets. Okay. It's also interesting to note the organization size. You would think that this is a problem that really afflicts the very large organizations. Not true. A lot of the small, medium enterprises are suffering and adopting this as well. In fact, the SMEs are much more aggressive and creative in their adoption of this technology, given the double pressure they face. On the one side, they don't have the staff or the volume to be able to contract this out and make it meaningful for a provider. On the other hand, neither the security requirements are being watered down, nor are the compliance requirements being dumbed down. So they're really caught in a vise, having to do more with less, and they tend to be much more innovative and much more demanding of their IT budget than some of the larger organizations. What is difficult, this survey asked, and as you can see, number one on the list is the ability to understand what is it that's coming through. Normalization and categorization of information is the hardest of all problems according to the survey, followed closely by searching. Why? Well, search is effective only if you know what you're looking for, and apparently that's also a significant challenge in this space. So as we've said, the mechanics of collecting, storing, and archiving log data is really not the primary focus 7 years into this space. That's pretty much been solved, with a significant exception that we'll look at in a minute. But the true challenge is making sense of what you got. I mean, the saying goes, it isn't what you have, but what you do with it that counts. And that's certainly the case with logs. Having said that, though, Windows logs continue to remain a challenge according to this survey. Now, nearly 70% of the infrastructure in the SME or even in the large enterprise is Windows, including desktops. So it's astonishing that this would remain such a significant challenge. A lot of the major players are very focused on syslog, which is the logging mechanism of choice of Cisco and IDSs and IPSs everywhere. And Windows doesn't do this, and so this becomes a challenge for collection even for a lot of those kinds of solutions. Something you should bear in mind as you think about veering towards a solution. So how have people in the vendor community approached this stuff? Well, there are those that say SIEM is the real problem, that is to say security event management, the incident management, the real-time stuff. They're focused really primarily on the security operations center. Well, who has a full-time SOC? One imagines that it would be the large enterprise that has a full-time SOC. Many SMEs would be lucky to have a dedicated security person and certainly won't have a SOC. So if a vendor says SIEM is the real problem and they focused on correlation, then it's most likely that they were addressing the Fortune 2000 type of space, the really large multinational companies. The approach here is, if you control and understand everything that's happening on the network, then you pretty much got a safe network, and safety or security is the focus here. Folks like ArcSight, RSAs, Envision, Intellitactics are representative of people who originated with SIEM as the real problem. And then there are those who say SIM is the real problem, that is to say security information management. They're focused on archival, they're focused on compliance reporting. Examples that come to mind that originated with SIM as the real problem are people like Sensage, people like LogLogic, where the correlation aspect of it is not that important. It's much more important to be efficient in archival. Now today, of course, we said SIM plus SIEM equals SIEM. So a lot of the vendors have developed capabilities in other areas, but it's useful to know where they originated from, simply because they tend to be much stronger in those areas than others. But it doesn't end there. There are folks who think that normalization is the key. ArcSight is a good example of this. To be able to import or to receive logs from a source, a connector is required, a parser, so that it can convert the log from the vendor-defined format to whatever it is that the software needs, the normalized method, a standard SQL schema. And vendors in this space, particularly larger ones, have tended to have their own standard about what constitutes a standard SQL schema. ArcSight is an example, LogLogic is an example, and so on. One of the challenges with this approach is you wind up having a significant ODBC management problem. Very often the Oracle cost or the SQL Server cost may rise to be as complex and as high as the cost for the SIEM software itself. Of course, it demands a DBA. So if you're thinking this is the approach you want to take to satisfy the SOC, be aware that those are the prices that you have to pay for admission. There are certainly people in the space who come at it from a vulnerability viewpoint, and this is a little surprising. You wouldn't think that vulnerability and log management have something to do with each other. There are vendors who have thought, Tenable is one example, who have really excel at the vulnerability space and have offerings in the log management space. And then there are yet others who have a much more serious view of the network. QRadar is one example, where their expertise originated in the NetFlow, JFlow universe. It's another example of how the network is the computer, the old saying from Sun Microsystems. And they figure if they understand that code, then that's the way you get to security. How you get to compliance or SIEM kinds of things is another story entirely. Let's look at market segmentation. If you considered the number of deals that were available in the enterprise space, there'd be 2,000. This is the F2000, and that's represented by that block. By the same token, the number of deals available in the SME are significantly more because there are more SME companies than there are Fortune 2000s, about 5 to 10 times as many, or even 20 times as many. And then you have small, medium businesses, and there's a very, very large number of these available, but below a certain threshold, they're not even really interesting for automation. And so the number of deals is relatively smaller because they're simply not interested in this type of technology. Now, at the top end, the primary motivation is compliance. As you come further down the chain, they also have security concerns and they have operational concerns. In the enterprise, you have almost equal staff available for the host versus the network piece, and even perhaps for the voice pieces. And so you can say that the division is around 50-50. Vendors that have approached the problem from the host side, such as Symantec or LogLogic or Computer Associates or even Mother Microsoft, tend to fall in this category. People who have approached it from the network perspective are the people like ArcSight, NetForensics, and RSA. And then at the SMB level, most of the effort is on the host side. You get very little by network. You have very few dedicated network people, if any. And if you look at the buy tends to be more hosting than it tends to be network devices, i.e. you have many, many more servers being purchased in an SMB than you have Cisco or Checkpoint or IDS, IPS kind of stuff. In the SME, it tends to be about 70-30, whereas in the SMB it was around 90-10, and in the enterprise it was 50-50. So here again, products such as Event Tracker, which is the one that I've been involved with, come more from the host side, whereas the TriGeo solution now sold to SolarWinds used to focus more on the non-Windows network side of the house. So this is how the market is really segmented. How do you decide what's right for you? Well, the steps to this are quite straightforward and the same as you would get with any other large IT project. It's a useful thing to start with the real reason. Whatever that reason is, if you can enunciate it, if you can articulate it, that would be a really good thing. For instance, you're interested in monitoring for PCI DSS, or your interest is to protect your web applications, or you're looking to monitor critical servers for suspicious login. If you're able to articulate a few points that what the real reason for doing this is, it'll help you significantly in deciding on what's right for you. The second important point to mention is you should really think about your log sources. Remember we said that Windows log collection is a problem? Well, there are some folks, Event Tracker is one, who excel at this. So if the preponderance of your problem is Windows, you should consider what is it that you're trying to get. You should size the environment. This is a problem that we see regularly. Because the environment isn't sized appropriately, vendors then tend to supply the smallest possible box, which you outgrow pretty quickly, then requiring you to get a surprise in your budget. So you should think about a phased approach. Can you start small and expand as time goes by? But the more you are aware of the volume of logs that you're going to receive, the more successful you will be in deciding what's right for you. You should also take time to describe what are the features you're looking for. A lot of these vendors, us included, really excel at certain portions and do a passable or an inadequate job at others. So questions like, which reports do you want? What trend reports are you interested in? Are you interested in role-based dashboards? Is NetFlow or JFlow important to you? Are you interested in search as your primary interface? Are you thinking that you need to do change monitoring? Is your function mostly SIEM or mostly SIEM? Does it have an ops flavor to it? Is it a mix of all of the above? These kinds of decisions, if you're able to describe features, if you're able to describe, you'll be much better off. No point generating 500-page RFPs. They don't benefit anybody. So if it takes you more than 10 pages to explain and enunciate what's right for you, something's not right. You need to go back and prune so that you can get to the heart of it. So there are some myths that vendor marketing has helped to propagate, and if you hear any of these, run for the hills because they're quite patently false. Here's the first one of those. The product is auto-learning. It doesn't require any tuning at all. Well, there is no product of this type that is practically possible in the SIEM space. That would be tantamount to the car figuring out that it can also drive itself and park itself here at the Crystal City Marriott and in the appropriate space closest to the front door. That's just simply not possible today. So if somebody says it will auto-learn, all you got to do is plug it in, well, you're seeing pink elephants, and it's only 10 a.m. The second myth that gets propagated by some of this vendor marketing hype is, my box is so smart that it's really an analyst in a box. Well, this is completely not possible for the same reason. Tuning is required, just like a car requires gas, and a person is required to understand what is it that the product is really putting out. So really, it's a box for an analyst. And in today's universe, all boxes are virtual, so you should really be thinking of a virtual box for the analyst and not an analyst in a box. Another myth that you see from time to time is the product is intuitive in its interface. You require minimal or no training at all. Well, given the complexity of what SIEM is trying to achieve, it's nice to believe this, but it's quite patently false. To get more value out of the tool or the solution, it is really important that you train for it, that you understand it. Hand in hand is the myth that SIEM is a scientific exercise. It isn't. It's more like an art form. After all, with the same exact clues, a Sherlock Holmes who's trained himself is able to see a lot more than Dr. Watson. I mean, they're both looking at the same clues. And so it's more like an art to be able to dig through these forms, and you have a heavy dose of politics on the side. What do I mean by this? Well, remember, the log data probably belongs to all sorts of different divisions or departments within your organization, and in many companies, getting that stuff together requires a healthy dose of politics. So if you see any of these myths abound, you realize that they're really not true at all. So now that we've looked at how you decide what's right for you, let's look at some worst practices. Before we can do that, let's look at the classic project lifecycle. I said to you, picking a SIEM is no different than any other large IT project. And so what should the lifecycle be? Well, quite simply, determine the need by talking to multiple people. What are you trying to accomplish? Write it down, we said. Define the scope so that you understand who's involved and what might their needs be. Using that, go into the market. Now that you understand the motivations of the different players, where they come from, what they really excel at, you can probably now make a short list of vendors that's more suitable for your need and your scope. When you've picked, conduct a proof of concept, the one that you think, or the two or the three that you think are your best shots. Conduct a proof of concept and then deploy, preferably deploy your initial set. Use it for a while so that you're familiar with it and you understand how it's working before you go into expansion. So a very classical SIEM project lifecycle, not unlike anything else that you're doing in IT. But it's astonishing how often and how regularly these things go wrong. So to illustrate, rather than bombard you with best practices, I'm going to bombard you with some worst practices, and you recognize how not to do some of this stuff. Hopefully it can help you. We talked about the first step being determine the need. Well, the worst thing you can do is completely skip this step and just buy something. That's because Fred across the street has it, you might as well buy it. Security, schmecurity. Or compliance or operations, never even bother to ask this question. Right? Just buy something. That would be the worst way of going about this. We talked about defining scope, where you talk to other people in the company and then you understood what is it that you were trying to really get. Well, if you try to be vague about this, don't ask questions like, are you interested in real time? What platforms are you receiving logs from? What kind of volume are we talking about here? Do we need reports? If so, what kind? Who gets them? What sort of alerting in real time do we need? And what kind of usage? Are we talking about 2 people accessing the system, 20 people accessing the system? The more vague you are in not answering these kinds of questions, the harder it is for you to even decide who should be on your shortlist. So don't do it this way. Also, assuming you're the only stakeholder is another mistake. Of course, there are going to be other entities in the organization that are interested, and including their views at this stage helps you to get a product that's more suited for your enterprise. Then you shortlist vendors. And how not to do it? Well, choose by relationship, for example. Simply accept the SIEM that came free with your antivirus or your operating system or your IDS solution. That would be a terrible way because it has nothing to do with the scope or the need of your company. I mean, if it turns out that it matches, that's another story, but choosing it by default is a terrible approach. Also, be overwhelmed by the slick PowerPoint. Salespeople are very good at what they do, and they can present really compelling PowerPoints, but you want to think about that and not just choose by PowerPoint power alone. You also want to be careful about choosing by initial price. Vendors, of course, don't want to give you sticker shock, but there are usually multiple options available, modules for correlation, for behavior, for knowledge, for connectors, things of that sort. What's the total cost of all of that, plus support, plus training? So it isn't the initial sticker price, it's the 3-year cost of actually keeping this is what you should be looking at. If you choose by initial price alone, the odds are that you're going to be in for a rude shock within 3 months. And that's not good for anybody's mojo. The next step is to conduct the proof of concept. The worst thing to do is to not conduct one at all. Equally worse is to either allow the vendor to dictate the POC or ignore the vendor completely as you do your POC. I mean, after all, they've spent a lot of time in this space and they understand the problem. They're perfectly able to offer meaningful suggestions. It doesn't mean you should let them run it, but you shouldn't be ignoring them completely also. The last point is, if you don't verify the references, that's a really bad thing. Lots of vendors are perfectly prepared to give you references comparable to you in size. It's the same as you would do for a new hire. You would check the references and you check them dispassionately without being wedded to the candidate. In the same way, you should conduct reference checks for your selection. All right, so now we are into the deployment phase. Some of the things that we've seen as worst practices are a complete lack of planning on the part of the buyer. No admin access been created, scrambling to configure the network of firewall at the last moment. If it's a software solution, using old and repurposing old hardware, surprising staff with the schedule so that they don't have time to be prepared for the training, and completely ignoring the vendor recommendations. These are all horrible ways to deploy. And what they will do for you is have a poorly deployed solution, which is probably way suboptimal, leading to a high chance that this is not going to meet your requirement at all, regardless of how planned and organized you've been to this stage. Don't do it. Next is the use part. As you are using the product, it's a good idea to be upgraded to new releases. Vendors spend lots and lots of time with this. And when you do that, you get the benefit of all of the fixes and the performance improvements that they've got. You should also be looking at support contracts so that you can get support from the vendor in a meaningful time frame. Skimping on this part makes it difficult for you, difficult for them. Vendors often have best practices on how to manage their own equipment incorporating them into your maintenance schedule is an excellent idea. Also, be aware that this technology is often evaluated by a crack security team, but then is used by a regular ops team, may not be the most senior people in the organization. These folks require training. Otherwise, the grand scheme that you concocted will not come to pass because the people that are putting this to work have no idea what was in your head when you decided to buy this product. So providing training to the actual users is a very, very good idea indeed. Now, once you've gotten used to it and it looks like it's working, it's now possible to think about expansion. Right? You shouldn't be running your entire enterprise in one blow. What are some of the pitfalls? Well, if you haven't designated a product owner, the product has become an orphan and no one really is in charge. No one understands how and why you're using this and why it becomes better. You should also check for changed needs. Very often in an organization, the requirements for SIEM a year later, as you're ready to expand, may have morphed. Very often we see operational requirements have crept into the mix and become almost as important as security or compliance. You'd also worry about scalability. Just because it worked for 10 servers, it doesn't mean it'll work for 1,000. That's something to specifically check during the POC stage, but especially as you're trying to expand. All kidding aside, implementing log management or SIEM is a typical IT project. You should plan early and plan often for a successful implementation. You should match your needs to the product features rather than just simply accept what the vendor is telling you or what Fred across the street might have purchased. You should conduct a pilot. You should check those references to verify claims. These are steps towards a successful implementation. And of course, the vendor is not your enemy. The more of a partnership you can rock with that vendor, the better off you'll be in the long run. For more information or to download this presentation, you can get it at our website, eventtracker.com, ITSAC 2011. We're also exhibiting at the Vendor Expo, and we're in booth 408, downstairs on the Independence level. We're across from Splunk and we're next to ArcSight, so please drop on by. If I haven't answered any questions, I'd be happy to do that. I will be available for a few hours more. Thank you for your interest. Happy logging.